My name's Hubert Danso. I'm the CEO and chairman of Africa Investor Group. We're an institutional infrastructure investment platform with a particular focus on Africa, partnering with African as well as international institutional investors. And I also chair the African Union's Continental Business Network, which reports into leading African heads of state on infrastructure investment. And I also chair the African Green Infrastructure Investment Bank's advisory board. Thank you. I'm glad to be here. As the asset owner community, we witnessed at COP26 in Glasgow the increased responsibility shifting from governments to private capital to invest in assisting emerging market and developing countries address their 100 billion per annum, or the promised 100 billion per annum but not received, adaptation and mitigation finance, which is a fundamental and concerning issue for us as asset owners, because the precursor, in our view, for private capital to flow at scale is a significant increase in the risk allocation to multilateral development banks, which we feel needs to be driven as part of the net zero institutional reform agenda by their government shareholders, which hasn't happened to date, and we certainly hope between now and COP27 it will happen. But in any case, in recognition and in anticipation of this, our focus at Africa Investor has really been to design and deliver greater public-private finance mandate alignment and more catalytic private investment pathways that fast-track private capital's participation in the green economy, and that also can be implemented through go-to-market institutional investor public partnership vehicles such as the African Green Infrastructure Investment Bank. And the African Green Infrastructure Investment Bank is an African Union convened and supported and an African institutional investor-led global finance initiative to catalyze private capital for Africa's green transition in the run-up to COP27 in Africa and beyond. It recognizes, primarily that there is no leading purely green financial institution in Africa to address the continent's $3 trillion of nationally determined contribution projects that need to be implemented by 2030. So the African Green Infrastructure Investment Bank is our platform, and it's being established as a for-profit permanent capital vehicle style entity working to build an enduring institution that can support governments and private capital, participate in this $3 trillion worth of nationally determined contribution-related projects. I mean, if you just think about the renewable energy potential in the continent, I mean, Africa possesses an astonishing technical wind potential of almost 180,000 terawatt hours per year, which is really basically enough to satisfy the entire continent's electricity needs, many times over. So we know that that's a really important issue, and one that we're actually going, 250 times. I mean, that's really what that capacity can actually deliver. So the African Green Infrastructure Investment Bank will actually be a cornerstone ecosystem investor, and it's establishing a very flexible business model that will allow it to maximize impact across the strategic range of Paris Agreement and net zero mission aligned commercial activities. And we're going to ensure that each project and its portfolio as a whole will enable it to earn risk appropriate returns. We're going to be closing all transactions on a fully commercial basis and fully commercial terms in line with all co-investors. The African Green Infrastructure Investment Bank is really going to be a green and profitable, not green or profitable platform. And we believe that it's going to be a very stable piece and reliable piece of institutional investors' portfolios. I mean, if you think about the growth dynamic and the reshaping of the global, private sector and the economy to facilitate this transition, we already know, for example, that the next 1,000 unicorns, companies with a valuation in excess of $1 billion, will be green and clean tech companies, no longer the media, the Facebook and the Googles of this world, but more aligned to the Teslas. And we've seen a few unicorns in Africa already, and we expect to support and see many more to serve the 10 trillion a year and growing global green industrial commercial complex. Just in terms of capital recruitment, the African Green Infrastructure Investment Bank will raise essentially about $3 to $5 billion from African institutional investors and governments, and mobilize approximately 20 billion from our G7 and G20 institutional investment partners that we are already co-developing the platform with. And of course, in addition to that, we welcome the participation of other institutional investors seeking net zero de-risked exposure to Africa and emerging markets. So if I were to really just sort of summarize that up, what's the defining character of this African Green Infrastructure Investment Bank platform? One, it's a unique institutional investor public partnership model, the first of its type, focused on net zero in Africa. Secondly, it's evergreen in nature. So it attracts long-term investors looking for green impact and very long and stable returns. Thirdly, it acts commercially and invests profitably for market returns in construction and operational phases. And ultimately, it solves market failures. So we will be able to attract the top talent and a broad stakeholder support on both a national and international level. And importantly, as I mentioned, AFGIB will be a green and profitable, not green or profitable, and stable, reliable piece of institutional investors' portfolios. So I'll leave it there. I mean, we know that fostering the financial conditions for a rapid deployment of clean energy in emerging and developing economies and the creation of new regulatory frameworks that will allow for the mobilization and deployment of private capital at scale and at speed is one of the defining challenges of our times. There's absolutely no question about that. I think COP26 laid that very bare. But I believe we're also aware that the legal and regulatory architecture in its current form is incapable of delivering the demands of net zero targets, especially in terms of capital formation at scale and accelerated capital deployment. I mean, we cannot say we're acting with high ambition and urgency when it takes the equivalent of 6 to 10 annual COP summits for what is today the average time for some major net zero infrastructure projects to reach financial close in emerging and frontier markets, and some developing markets too, mind you. So I think that's also the case. But with that in mind, and during COP26, we announced the model law for institutional investor public partnerships as an initiative, and that is really to design the framework that I mentioned earlier. So it's to design the framework to deliver greater public-private finance mandate alignment and more catalytic private investment pathways that fast-track, scale, and de-risk private capital's participation in the green and just transition in emerging and developing countries, implemented through institutional investor public partnerships. So we're putting the meat on the bone now. So essentially, the Model Law on Institutional Investor Public Partnership Initiative is a collaboration led by the African Green Infrastructure Investment Bank and our global partner, the CFA Asset Owners Council out of New York, in association with global law firm DLA Piper, which is also COP26's legal services provider. And this was first espoused by the African Union's 5% Institutional Infrastructure Investment Agenda initiative, and it's now championed as a global public good by the CFA Asset Owners Council in New York and its dedicated brain trust. So the model law framework is really going to assist emerging and developing countries to de-risk and meet their net zero capital mobilization goals. I mean, the model law essentially aims to introduce and enable the use of a newly designed infrastructure investment procurement regulation and framework that will operate directly between governments and global institutional investors for green and net zero infrastructure investment programs and projects, both domestically and across border. Specifically, the model law is a legal and regulatory partnership framework initiative for COP26 and COP27 to support the goals of the Paris Agreement, the Sustainable Development Goals, net zero, and the African Union's equivalent to the SDGs, which is known as Agenda 2063. And it's really designed primarily to help policymakers and global institutional investors specifically to mobilize private capital at scale, deploy that capital at speed, deepen and green secondary and capital markets, support innovative and clean tech project developers, as I mentioned earlier. And then ultimately, it will also launch a knowledge repository, a digital resource center for institutional investor-public partnerships for public and private sector stakeholders to actually get to understand the detail and get access to all of the knowledge, tools, and data that's available. So there are really 5 key objectives to this, model net zero law that we're putting together, and ultimately it's to create a legislative framework that incentivizes collaboration between institutional investors and the public sector in respect of the development and implementation of qualifying IIPP projects. The next major focus is that it can ensure that it can facilitate private sector investment into these projects in line with best international practice. Ultimately, as well, it also will be utilizing fast-track procurement processes to award the projects in a transparent, efficient, and streamlined manner, avoiding these typically high procurement costs and delays that stifle and stymie implementation. It's going to deliver a demonstration for value for money for governments through the participation of the private sector, both at implementation and delivery of the projects based on internationally recognized and bankable risk allocation best practice. And it will also provide for an effective and efficient contract management framework with easy access to dispute resolution where appropriate. So the model law initiative already, as all the media came out and sort of showcased, including your good selves, that the model law already enjoys the support of institutional investors representing now over 100 trillion of assets under management, and it's being seen as a key legal pathway instrument to fast-track allocations to investable net zero projects and to de-risk their participation in emerging markets. So in conclusion on this particular question, to me and us, it really does make sense that the creation of new regulatory frameworks that will allow for the mobilization and deployment of private capital at scale and at speed to emerging markets is being described as the single action that will deliver the most catalytic and biggest impact over the next 12 months as we gear up for what's going to be quite an epic showdown on this just transition issue, and one that private capital really wants to play a positive role, but we just have to make sure that what we do is in line with our investment policy statements and our mandates and risk-adjusted return criteria. So, we're very positive that, one thing is to amass the money that's required for the transition, but now we've got to create that plumbing, that architecture that we can actually deploy that capital within the timeframes that are the very, very unprecedented short timeframes that we have. So that's why we've driven that particular model, and each day we're getting different asset owner groups joining the initiative, providing their general counsels and legal counsels input into ensuring that it's a balanced instrument, that capital can be mobilized at scale and it can be deployed at speed. So I'll leave it there.